One morning after Spencer's class got out, he stopped by Jenna's apartment to pick up a book from her, and her apartment door was unlocked, which was a little bit out of the ordinary, but he didn't think anything of it and let himself in. There, he found Jenna's lifeless body lying on the bedroom floor, so he ran to a neighbor and called 911. Unfortunately, Jenna was cold to the touch and there was nothing that the paramedics could do. But the crime scene told a very strange story in that it didn't really have one. The only injury that was visible on Jenna's body right away was a small bruise on her forehead, and they saw that she had bitten down on her own tongue. Ouch. There didn't appear to be any sort of break-in or robbery. Her purse was still on the hook by the door, complete with her cash, credit card, and keys inside. There was no substances found at the scene or in her system, and there was no indication that she'd taken her own life. Spencer told the police that the last time that he saw her was when they were studying together the night before, and he had left her place sometime after midnight. Then he called Jenna when he got home around 12:30 to say goodnight. So somehow, in less than a 12-hour window, someone had broken into Jenna's apartment and attacked her in a way that they still couldn't really figure out. Finally, during Jenna's autopsy, officials were able to figure out how she was. The medical examiner noticed that Jenna had broken blood vessels in the whites of her eyes that pointed to signs of asphyxiation. That seemed like a very intimate and personal attack, doesn't it? So who do you suppose was the first person that they suspected to be behind it? Well, when detectives found out that Spencer and Jenna had a history of breaking up and getting back together, it all seemed to check out. An obsessed lover with the exact kind of motive the police were looking for. Now, Spencer was allegedly the last person to have seen Jenna alive. So yeah, a pair with no signs of forced entry. An on and off again relationship. And a buttload of statistics of the boyfriend did it. Spencer didn't stand a chance. Meanwhile, they began to look into anyone else that might have a reason to harm Jenna and found pretty much nothing. Jenna seemingly didn't have an enemy in the world. She was well loved by her friends and classmates and had been working as a waitress to put herself through college. Sounds like me. Friends said that her job was nearly full-time at the local restaurant and she worked at, while she also attended classes. Jenna was described as a devoted student who worked hard for everything she had in life. Detectives could clearly see that, and the more that they learned about Jenna's outstanding character and drive to succeed, the more important it became to get her the justice that she deserved. Now, they saw her walk to her vehicle, safely get inside, and drive away without anyone following her. Jenna was home by 9:30, where Spencer would stop by to study with her. He stayed for about 3 hours and left after midnight, like we said. But finally, the first lead in the case came thanks to some cliche college kids. I call them cliche because they were doing one of the most cliche college kids activities I could ever think of. They were playing sand volleyball at midnight. It sounds like something I would do in college. There are only 2 instances in your adult life when sand volleyball at midnight will ever sound like a good idea. The first is if you're a member of the NXIVM cult and Keith Raniere has just invited you to play. And the second is when you're in college experiencing freedom for the first time while hormones course through your body with the strength of 1,000 suns. On the night Jenna was attacked, the neighbors had been playing on the sand courts in the complex, reporting seeing a suspicious character. Sometime after midnight, the players saw a shirtless man walking from the direction of Jenna's apartment who seemed agitated. Some of the women in the group even described him as a scary looking. And we always trust a women's intuition. Others said he resembled a 26-year-old student they knew named Sean Stevens, who lived in the adjoining building. Authorities asked Jenna's friends if she knew Sean Stevens, and they said that she did. Apparently, Sean made a vulgar remark to Jenna one time. Jenna had been walking to her car in the parking lot when Sean catcalled her from the balcony. Well, Jenna was a b****s and was like, "The hell did you just say to me?" And the two got into an argument. Sean's apartment also had a direct line of sight into Jenna's apartment. Nope, don't like that. The police questioned Sean, and right off the bat, the guy was nervous as hell. They said he couldn't stop shaking and denied having anything to do with crime or being the shirtless man seen leaving her apartment. However, Sean couldn't give them an alibi for where he was that night because he claimed he was so wasted that he blacked out. As Sean was beginning to seem more like a suspect, the detectives still didn't rule out the possibility of Spencer. But then, investigators got word of yet another potential suspect. 2 months earlier, Jenna had told her parents about an incident with the maintenance guy at her apartment. What? One morning, after getting out of the shower, she got the scare of her life when she discovered the maintenance guy in her complex standing in the living room of her apartment. Now that's not creepy. He apologized and told Jenna that he hadn't heard the water running and thought the apartment was empty, so he walked inside. Okay. Yeah, because that's how that works. Yeah, right. Jenna said the maintenance guy had no reason to be in there, which he didn't, and really had no idea why he was. She contacted the supervisor and reported what had happened to her, and they said that they'd take care of it. the police found out that the maintenance worker of the complex was a dude named Jeremy Rosser. The 29-year-old was recently divorced with 2 kids, and he had never been in trouble with the law before. Statistically, that made him an unlikely suspect for investigators, but after hearing the story Jenna had told her parents, they still had cause to suspect him. Cause what the hell are you doing in her apartment? They decided to test and see if Jeremy's tale about the shower really had been truthful. They had one detective stand in Jenna's bathroom with the door closed and run the shower while the other stood by the front door and listened. They could clearly hear the shower running from outside the door, which meant that Jeremy had lied. They also found out that 1 week after Jenna was Jeremy was fired because he suddenly stopped coming into work. That was creepy enough for the detectives, and Jeremy became suspect number 3. So authorities now had 3 potential beans in their whodunit stew, and they still couldn't lock down a motive. Police wanted to question Jeremy, but he had skipped town and no one had a clue where to. They also found out that Jenna's boyfriend Spencer was also suddenly missing. When they went to look for their 3rd suspect, neighbor Sean, he was also nowhere to be found. Boys, you were really not helping your cases here. Investigators needed to decide who to pursue first, so they started to weigh their options. Let's see. So there was Spencer, the boyfriend, who was the last person to have seen her alive, Sean, the neighbor who resembled the man seen leaving her apartment that night, and Jeremy, the creep who'd let himself into Jenna's apartment while she was showering. Investigators turned to forensic experts and hoped that they could find some traces of DNA evidence that would point to who their strangler could be. They were in luck when 2 different sets of skin cells with male DNA were found underneath Jenna's fingernails. This wasn't surprising to find on someone like Jenna, who probably fought like hell against her attacker, just like she always had in life. Investigators also found small drops of blood on the carpet, as well as on Jenna's shirt that they had sent in for testing. The results showed one of the DNA profiles to belong to Jenna, while the other matched one of the unknown male DNA suspects. Now, if Jenna had been fighting hard and scratching, there was a good chance that the perpetrator could have gotten cut and dripped on the floor, and this was a very exciting find for the investigators. Armed with DNA, they knew what they had to do and wanted samples from Spencer, Sean, and Jeremy. Officials also decided to cover all their bases and ask for any men who lived in Jenna's apartment complex or worked with her to volunteer DNA samples if they were willing to. Over 50 men came forward to give DNA, and they were all ruled out. Eventually, the authorities found Spencer at his home 3 hours away. When they asked him why he'd left town, understandably, he said he was upset and needed to be with his family. He was totally cooperative with the cops and let them take photos of him without his shirt on, where they saw no scratch marks on his body. Police suspected him less and less when he was willing to answer all their questions without an attorney present and eagerly gave them a DNA sample. It seemed pretty clear to them that Spencer was just another victim in this senseless tragedy. Next, the authorities tracked down Jenna's neighbor, Sean, and found out that he was over 450 miles away in Oklahoma with his family. His brother was on leave for military service in Iraq and had just gotten home after spending months abroad. Sean also willingly provided a DNA sample without a court order, which led them to believe he had nothing to hide as well.
Oh, what am I doing here? Visiting my brother who just got back from serving his country. What are you doing here?
That meant that the only man left to talk to was Jeremy. Officers were able to find him via his ex-wife, who pointed them in his direction and also gave them more reason to suspect him. She said he had been showing signs of extreme aggression around the time of their divorce, and that one moment in their relationship stood out to her in particular. She remembered getting into an argument with him, and at one point, he shoved her to the ground and put his hands around her throat. Apparently, this happened right around the same time that Jenna was attacked. Now, despite this detail, the cops still found it odd that Jeremy didn't have a criminal history of any kind, as usually someone who attacked with that level of brutality did. When they finally brought Jeremy in for questioning, he complied with investigators and answered their questions while still denying any involvement with the crime. He allowed them to take pictures of his body and search his car. In his car, they found a laptop with a serial number that had been reported stolen months earlier by a resident in Jenna's apartment complex. They also found Rosser still had the set of keys to the apartments. Did they not ask for those back? This also meant that Jeremy actually did have a criminal history and had broken into apartments in the complex before. He had just never been caught. Well, technically he had by Jenna, and she even reported him, so what the hell? However, amongst the keys found in Jeremy's possession, Jenna's was not one of them. Just like the other 2 suspects, he willingly provided a DNA sample, and when he did, investigators were like, oh no. They were kind of banking on the fact that he was their suspect and he wouldn't want to give a DNA sample. Seeing as the other man had willingly done so, all signs were pointing to him. They collected his fluids and whatnot regardless and submitted all 3 profiles for testing. After ruling out over 50 men, detectives had 3 possible suspects left and hoped that they would get a match. Finally, the results came back. Jeremy had been the one in Jenna's apartment that night. Now, when police asked him how his skin cells would have ended up underneath Jenna's nails, he told them that he didn't know. When they told him that they were arresting him, however, he didn't act surprised. They were like,
We have every reason to believe that you're the one who did this.
and Jeremy sat there for a moment before responding.
So does that mean I'm under arrest?
He didn't scream or fight or try to defend himself. He was just like, kind of like, oh, okay, whatever. That's a red flag. By now, the police obviously knew that Jeremy's intrusion into Jenna's apartment while she was showering was no accident. Now, if anything, who's to say he wasn't scoping the place out for the next time that he'd be in there? Prosecutors alleged that Jeremy had used his master key that day as well as the night he ended Jenna's life. Even worse, they also believe that Jeremy had let himself into Jenna's apartment while she was at work that night and hid in the spare bedroom while waiting for her to come home. Except when she did, he hadn't planned for Spencer to come over as well. So he had to wait there for 3 whole hours until Spencer finally left. Sometime around 1 o'clock, Jenna went to bed. That's when investigators theorized that Jeremy jumped on top of her, and as she fought for her life, she managed to scratch him and get his DNA underneath her fingernails. Jeremy pled guilty to the crimes in order to spare his family the suffering of a trial and was sentenced to 55 years in prison. Not only did he end one promising young life and ruin the lives of those who loved her, but Jeremy also had 2 young daughters who would now grow up without a father. His one selfish choice negatively affected a lot of people that day. Jeremy never explained his motive either, and some experts believe that maybe he'd only planned to burglarize her home, but when she got home from her job, she surprised him. Others suggested that Jeremy's wife bore a striking resemblance to Jenna, and it's possible he could have taken his anger about the divorce out on her when the similarities in their appearances triggered him. Unfortunately, we'll probably never know because Jeremy refuses to talk. That was why the DNA was so especially crucial in this case, because without it, the police would have never come up with a motive because there essentially wasn't one. Jenna Verhaalen had her whole life ahead of her, and one selfish choice by some took that all away. When the police were faced with the dilemma of 3 suspects and no motive, Jenna fought like hell, just as she always did, and was able to help them catch the right suspect and bring some small sense of justice to her and her family. Thank you so much for watching. Y'all are really some awesome human beings. I'll see you next time.